Hi, my name's Alex Kirk. I'm the Global Principal Engineer with Corelight. I'm here to talk to you today about simplifying and accelerating your security operations with a single source of network truth, specifically done through the combination of Corelight and Chronicle. As we all know, network evidence is an important piece of what is known these days as the SOC triad, that combination of endpoint data, network data, and threat intelligence that comes into your central SIM for analytics today. And while this is a very simple message at its core, it's actually much more complex in the real world. Typically, because organizations are collecting the data to put into that analytics with a process that looks something like this, where they're touching a variety of different systems, be they application servers, network devices, security systems, endpoint hosts, and bringing all of those disparate log formats that are coming in from different vendors with no kind of concept of normalization between them into a central location and simply hoping that they'll be able to make sense of that data once it's in there. And while there are certain things like the Chronicle UDM that make mapping all these data sources a little bit easier, the reality that we face is that not every vendor is going to be compatible with that data model. And even if they are compatible, it may only be to a certain degree. And not only that, the administrative overhead of maintaining all of these log sources in the first place is rather substantial on its own right, in particular because it's entirely too easy for systems that are owned by teams outside of security to come along and, for example, turn down the verbosity of logging on this firewall just to save some CPU cycles because things are getting stretched thin on older hardware. And in reality, you have yourself a bureaucratic process on your hands that is going to continue in the long term and end up producing data that is not only difficult to normalize, but in many cases is simply incomplete for security as well. In the case of DNS, for example, it's particularly common to log that off of an organization's Active Directory servers. And while it is possible to get the answers to queries being returned in those logs, I had one customer that purchased Corelight simply because the costs in terms of CPU cycles to turn on that verbose of a log in Active Directory meant that they would have had to upgrade their entire AD forest at a project and dollar cost that was substantially higher than implementing Corelight and getting that better quality data in the first place with a simpler process. And so realistically, what Corelight is designed to do, instead of having to touch each of these distinct sets of data within the network and maintain all these different spots, is to pull packet data directly from the wire. And we do that traditionally via a packet broker on an on-premise sort of a location, but increasingly with virtual taps that are available in the cloud as well. I know that GCP in particular was early to the game in terms of bringing a very useful VTAP to the environment. And we take all of that raw packet data and convert that into a set of logs that is comprehensive about everything that has gone on the network in the environment that you're monitoring, as well as a series of alerts that are generated on that data, both by Zeek itself and the Suricata intrusion detection engine that Corelight has brought to our appliances recently. And while we can additionally extract files at a line rate of 15,000 per minute, where the true power is bringing all of this data into that analytics lake and making it accessible to the end user. Now, the best part about this data is that in addition to being UDM compliant, we have designed it to be internally consistent so that each of the logs that are generated, whether that's a layer 4 sort of NetFlow++ connection log here that has more than just the traditional flow locations, but also the layer 7 HTTP record here, or perhaps a file being transferred over HTTP, all of these are going to be linked together by a unique identifier that we lay down on a per connection basis so that it's very easy to pivot in between all the different portions of a connection and really wrap everything up together very quickly for an analyst. But instead of me telling you about all this, let me actually show it to you specifically within the Chronicle interface today. So as we come into the demo here, the first thing that we're going to do is go into the Enterprise Insights dashboard, because that's the most likely workflow for an analyst coming in here and using this data to drill down and do something intelligent with it. We're going to go ahead and start by looking at an IOC domain name match. This sweetcoldwater.com one looks kind of interesting, and so we'll dig into it first. And once we click in, we see that we get a asset-specific view here. We're looking at the view for the domain of sweetcoldwater.com in particular. You can see that there's enrichments like the who is information that shows that we've got a privacy protected contact email, that this thing was created a long time ago and is still active. But what really sticks out when we come in here and look at this is all these associated subdomains that have a very peculiar structure. So if we want to dig into those a little further, we're going to go into an asset view based upon what asset made some of these queries and click in here. And as we transition into the view, we can very quickly see that something very funny is going on here. These domain names all have a structure that looks kind of suspiciously like a hex encoded string of some kind. And all of the events that we see in this time frame are low prevalence domains. They're new to the enterprise. And if we were to click in here on one of the event views, we can see the raw log information here that was recorded by Corelight. And not only do we have this odd domain name here, but we can see that the query type is text and not an A record like you would expect if this was just a CDN with a strangely named backend schema here. So it's pretty clear at this point that we've got ourselves a DNS tunnel on our hands. And we were able to do this based upon that IOC matching, which is wonderful. But what if we wanted to do this more generically going forward? So in order to try to build some detection logic that would look for these rather oversized domains that we see here, we would go ahead and come into the rule editor that comes with the Chronicle view. And we already have written a Corelight specific detection to catch this. So if we hop into this rule specifically, we see that it's actually a pretty simple rule to be able to understand. We've got some metadata that tells us who wrote it, what the severity is, and that it's matching a host sending a large number of long DNS queries that is most likely exfiltration of some kind. And all we really need to do is come in here and specify that the data is coming from Corelight, that it is of type DNS, that the query name is at least 100 characters, all coming from a single source IP. And then we say that if that has happened over the span of 1 hour and we have at least 50 of those domain queries triggering, then go ahead and raise an alert in the Chronicle interface and have another way to catch DNS tunnels generically and not just do indicator of compromise matching. Now, once we've got this detection built, we can come in here and set this up to either be a live rule that runs on streaming detections, whether or not it's going to generate alerts, as well as give us the ability to do a retroactive hunt within our data based upon this new detection that we put together. And if we were to come in here and look at rule detection specifically, we can see that there were 2 retroactive hunts that made a detection once this rule had been put in place. So it's a very easy process to be able to take indicators for something that might have been a long-running breach or other historical event and be able to detect on them immediately within the Chronicle interface. So coming back into the Enterprise Insights dashboard, we're going to use one of these other domain matches, this one specifically called out as a command and control piece of malware, to walk you through a slightly different flow viewing this data. So if we come in here and we pick one of the assets that this has applied to, we're going to see that the event timeline here is actually stitched together a number of different Corelight logs. If you come in and look at the raw logs, you'll see that we've got first the DNS log that shows the lookup to this coursemclures.com domain, but we've also got the connection log on the resultant TCP connection, as well as the HTTP transaction that took place over that connection. And if we look closely in here, we see that this URI is a little bit odd to start with. I mean, it could be indicative of some sort of a dynamic chain of application execution here. But what's particularly striking is we see that the MIME type that came back here was an application DOS exec, and it has a strange name of SOCI5 here. So what we're going to want to do to try to get some more information on that file here is pivot based upon the unique identifier that Corelight has laid down for that file, and come in here and do a raw log search that is going to go ahead and return information about that file itself. Now, again, once this comes up here, Chronicle is enriching things in such a way that you've got particular type information for the file here. And so we can see that it's already gone ahead and prefetched information about what the partners think about this. And we can see that there's some malicious detections here. There's an easy link to view this in VirusTotal, and we see that, again, this is definitely malicious. And so it's really just been a couple of clicks into an investigation, and we now already know that not only is there an infection on our hands, but we know what kind of infection it is. And we could potentially search on, for example, this SHA and find out that there are other assets that have observed this in our environment to date. Now, sometimes there are detections that you can do within the Chronicle interface that don't make sense to pull out of the enterprise dashboard and don't necessarily make sense to do as a detection rule because of the lack of need for thresholds or any other specificity like that. And what we can do in a case like that is a structured search, where here we're specifically looking for the Corelight data sets and the TLS server certificate subjects having a value of an organization for Internet Widgets, PTY Ltd, which is actually the defaults out of all of the X509 command line tools and other certificate generation setups. And it's something that I personally wrote a snort signature for as part of the SourceFire set 10 years ago, and have continued to see turn up anomalous behavior by malware and other malicious actors, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago on malwaretrafficanalysis.net. So if we do this search in here and come down into the structured view, we can quickly see that we've got a number of results popping up, thankfully, because of the ability to match into that structure and pull things back quickly. But by default, we're getting a set of columns that isn't very useful. So we're going to go ahead here and click into the columns and select to pull out some of these values that don't have anything in them, and instead put in certificate information that is going to be much more relevant to the view here. So if we do that, we can see that we do, in fact, have a bunch of these default certificate subjects all the way through that entire string. That's, again, the default out of all the certificate generation tools. And we can see that there's actually not only overlap of some of these showing up multiple times, but also distinct instances of those showing up in the environment. And again, if we wanted to pivot into any one of these, it's very easy to click into the log values and from there be able to dig into additional information in the Corelight logs about what has happened with that particular SSL connection. Now, while Chronicle is primarily designed to perform search, correlation, and IOC matching, it also includes dashboards and reporting too. It's easy to build a dashboard that can show you things like the different types of logs coming in from Corelight, the sorts of events that show up, Suricata alerts, you name it. And of course, all of this is highly customizable with a variety of inbuilt editing tools within the UI.